In My Reality, Chapter 1. The 36-year-old private investigator Alexander Kalden sat in his favorite chair, just like on every other evening. He was deep in his thoughts, eyes closed, but he was not relaxed at all. "How are you feeling, darling?" a voice came from his right. Alexander opened his eyes and saw Cassie, his wife, or more accurately, an image of her. The augmented reality implant in his head allowed him to see an image of her whenever he wanted, a moving, talking, lifelike image of her, as though she was a real person right there in the room with him. She was unquestionably beautiful, as always. She was looking at him affectionately with her shiny blue eyes while wearing a casual green dress, her long fair hair neatly laying on one shoulder. "I'm a little anxious," he replied. "I have a new case that I need to get briefed on in a little while. You know how I am. I always get anxious before any new case." "I understand you completely, Al, and you always have my full support. You are good at what you do, darling. I'm sure the case will be solved perfectly once again," the lifelike replica of Cassie said. Alexander always had the image of Cassie switched on via his implant when he was at home. It had been almost 5 years now, ever since she was taken from him by a handful of violent gangsters. Those responsible were brought to justice quickly and were sentenced to life in prison. But that did not bring his beloved wife back, and he missed her dearly. The feelings of longing for her were too great to bear, and he needed a way to cope with them. Back then he knew that a replica of a loved one could be created and uploaded onto his implant, so he did not lose time. He reincarnated his wife within his implant. Ever since then, she was always there, waiting for him in his apartment, and this kept him sane and contented. "Thanks, dear. It means a lot to me to have your support," he uttered. "I have a brilliant idea," she beamed after a few seconds. "Why don't we have a bath together when you come back? We can reminisce some of the fun adventures we had in the past." "I like the sound of that," Alexander agreed while closing his eyes again. He was sure he could almost feel Cassie touching him with affection. Her touch was what he missed the most, as this was something her augmented reality replica could not emulate. Despite that, seeing her and hearing her voice every day was invaluable to him. He knew that he would do anything to make sure he could have her near him, even if it's just her image and voice. A sudden piercing beeping noise snapped Alexander out of his relaxed state and broke the trail of his thoughts. He opened his eyes and saw a flashing alert icon in the corner of his field of vision. It was an alert he set himself, as it was time to get going. He had to pick up his investigating partner, Jane, and then head to the government bureau for his next assignment. Getting a job directly from the government bureau meant a lot, as they rarely ever dealt in trivial affairs. Without wasting time, Alexander exhaled deeply, then stood up from his chair and put on his long leather coat. "I have to go now, dear," he said to the image of his wife. "But I won't be long. I'll wait for you impatiently, Al. Be careful out there." He just gently smiled in response to her, then picked up his apartment keycard along with his portable stun gun and headed for the door. Upon opening the door, he glanced once more at Cassie, as though afraid that he would forget how she looked, and then left while slamming the door behind him. His car was just outside the apartment building. It was an older model, a few years old now, but Alexander liked it. He had fond memories of the early days of driving it. Cassie was still alive then, and together they used to take occasional trips out of town. The car to him was a reminder of the old life, the good life. To change it would mean to abandon those wonderful memories. Alexander couldn't possibly do that. He was zoned out in his thoughts during the entire drive, and by the time he snapped out, he was already approaching the apartment building where Jane lived. Jane was already outside, waiting for him. She was 29 years old, but her meticulous healthy routine every day allowed her to look even younger than that. Despite her good looks, she usually wore simple yet practical clothes, a long-sleeved top with a sleeveless jacket and some jeans. From all the times that Alexander remembered, Jane never wore flashy clothing and never overdid on makeup. She clearly preferred a modest and frugal look. "Sharp on time as always," she commented as she sat into the passenger seat of the car. "In our line of work, Lateness can mean the difference between getting the job and not getting it, Alexander responded. Absolutely, Jane agreed with a smile. Then, as Alexander drove off from the front of the apartment building, she continued. So, another job from the government bureau? I sense they're starting to warm up to us more and more. Well, we have a good track record. Our mission success rate speaks for itself. Jane didn't say anything, but Alexander could see that she agreed and was pleased with receiving a mission from the government bureau. Missions given by the bureau were always well paid and important, and not everyone qualified to receiving them. Alexander and Jane received only a handful of missions from them in the past, and now the government bureau was knocking on their door again for another. The traffic this evening was calm, but despite that, Alexander was feeling like every second was dragging on. The anticipation of the mission was teasing him. They couldn't get there fast enough from the way he felt. After several minutes, they arrived at their destination. Alexander parked his car in one of the visitor bays and along with Jane exited it. Then, without saying a word, they headed for the large, towering building where the government bureau was based. Names and reason for visit, one of the guards demanded. Alexander Calden and Jane Balin, private investigators. Here to receive a briefing of an assignment that was given to us this morning, Alexander spoke sternly. The guard's eyes moved around, most likely reading through the logs that his implant allowed him to see. After a few seconds of checking if everything was correct, he motioned with his hand for them to go on through. The bureau building was large and imposing, both on the outside and on the inside. The rooms were wide and spacious, and the lobby stretched all the way up to the top floor. The designers of the building were clearly given a free rein to use up as much space as they wanted. Most people's entire apartments in the city were smaller than some of these rooms. Any ordinary citizen would feel small and insignificant upon entering this building, and perhaps that was intentional. The two private investigators walked up the well-polished stairs to the first floor, whilst nonchalantly gazing around the fancy decor all around them. They already knew where to go, but their eyes kept getting distracted by everything around them. It was not every day that they could stroll through the hallways of the government bureau. The professional level of work the builders of this place had achieved was hard to pass by. Upon reaching a door at the end of the corridor, they knocked. A tall, clean-shaven man in his 50s and wearing an impeccably neat suit opened. "I've been expecting you," he said as they came into the room and shut the door behind them. "We have a critical mission for you two from an important client, so I hope you won't disappoint." It was laughably redundant to hear the man refer to the mission as critical, for Alexander knew that every mission from the government bureau was critical, no matter how simple it was. "We're ready for anything," he said with confidence after taking a deep breath. The man looked down at his electronic data pad to get the information, and his eyebrows lowered as he began concentrating. "Aurora Electronics, who, as you know, make all of our augmented reality gadgets and implants, have reported a suspicious activity in the implants of two users. They stated here that there's a very good chance there was unauthorized access into the operating system on which those implants are running. Since you will be handling this case, we are able to disclose the names and details of these users, but you must keep this information confidential." "You'd like us to find and question these people, right?" Jane wanted clarification. "Yes, but you cannot reveal further details of this assignment to them. If someone did try to hack into and manipulate their implants, we need to find the culprit without raising any alarms. For all we know, these people themselves could be responsible for doing so. We strongly encourage you to not take matters into your own hands beyond what the instructions tell you. Arrest these people if you have good reasons for doing so, but if anything needs escalating beyond that, then consult with us first." "Great. We'll question them both and get to the bottom of it. Is there anything else that we must know?" Alexander wanted to wrap this meeting up. "Your main task is to find the one responsible for this unauthorized access into the implant system and to bring them in for questioning. We'll contact you if our client sends us any more information. For now, I'll send you all the details. If there are no more questions, you're free to go," the man concluded. Chapter 2. Alexander and Jane stepped out of the bureau building once they got all the important data, both thinking about the new case. It seemed like a fairly simple case on the outside, but Alexander knew by now not to underestimate a case by how it seemed on first impressions. Let's discuss this in a cafe, shall we? Jane suggested. Sure, Alexander agreed after some hesitation. A small, modest cafe called the Peacemaker was nearby, positioned along the side of the main road and wedged between two rival clothes shops. Its neon yellow letters invited anyone who needed a break. Upon entering it and looking around, they saw a few of the tables already had customers who were having their evening meal, and there was a pleasant aroma of hot food in the air. Jane ordered some hot tea at the counter for both of them, and they then picked a small table near one of the quieter corners of the cafe, away from most people, as they didn't want anyone listening in on their conversation. Once they sat down, they resumed talking about the case. Here's what I was thinking, Jane began. I think it will be best for us to start paying visits to these people tomorrow. For this evening, let's take it easy and not rush. This will give me time to look up their addresses tonight, and also to go over the minute details of the case that we were sent. There could be important points that we weren't told about. Good idea, Alexander liked her suggestion. And I'll do a background check on these people and see if there's anything we can use to our leverage when questioning them. They could be trying to lie their way out of it, so we need all the ammunition we can get. For a moment, Jane had a look on her face that some kind of a thought grabbed all of her attention. Her eyes were just gazing down, and eyebrows were frowning. Her lips tightened. Something seemed off to her. Do you think these people could have tried to manipulate their own implants in some way? She then asked after a silent pause. Anything is possible. People might want to alter what the implant does. Have you ever felt that you needed your implant to do something that it cannot do? Alexander got lost in his head for a moment. That was a very good question, because he had such thoughts rather often. If only his implant could convey more about Cassie to him. If only he could touch and kiss her. If only he could hug her and hold her in his arms. If only she was physically real. I suppose I did have such wishes, Alexander admitted, but without giving any details. It's about your wife, isn't it? Jane asked gently while reading the expression on his face. Alexander was silent. He didn't feel the need to confirm what was obvious already. Jane could read him far too well. I'm sorry, Al, Jane apologized. I wish there was something I could do to help you. I don't think there's anything you can do, Alexander glanced at her, for a moment wondering if it would have been for the best if he moved on with his life and perhaps had someone kind like Jane as a wife. But moving on felt like he'd be betraying Cassie and erasing an important part of his own life. After a few moments of thinking, he added, I appreciate you looking out for me though. I understand what you're going through, Jane sympathized. Please know that I'm here for you if you are in a dark place. I want to try and support you as I know how important that can be. Thank you, Jane. Alexander was starting to feel uncomfortable, so he turned his gaze away and began scanning the room of the cafe and simply looking at other people there. His gaze stopped on one of the older men who was sitting by himself. The old man was looking down at his feet and talking. At first, Alexander thought that the man was merely thinking out loud, but then he managed to hear a few isolated words and phrases, and it sounded like the man was talking to a dog. It became clear at that moment that the old man was seeing his dog with the help of his implant. His dog was part of his reality, but to everyone else there was nothing but empty space there. Alexander imagined himself in that old man's place, also talking to an empty space every time he was spending time with his deceased wife. He briefly imagined how ridiculous he looked doing that. But why should it be a problem, he thought. After all, he only ever spoke to her when at home. That was his private time, and what everyone else thought about that was of no consequence. Poor man, Jane spoke as she also appeared to be looking at the old man. Sometimes it seems to me that technology is only making us feel more alone as time goes. Let's just finish our tea and go. I'd like to focus my thoughts on the assignment. Alexander changed the topic without responding to what Jane had said. He was not comfortable talking about this any further. Once they left the cafe, Alexander drove Jane back to her place without exchanging many words. Jane didn't push him. Instead, she was reading through the instructions they were given on her computer pad, making sure to pay attention to every line of the text. When they reached her place, they exchanged goodbyes, and Alexander drove off. During the journey home on his own, his head was filled with constantly warring thoughts. He wished all these thoughts would leave him alone and give him peace for once. But with time, as the years went by, it was getting harder and harder to control them and keep them in check. He was always doubting himself and everything in his existence, teetering between his inner desires and this uncertain reality all around him. When Alexander returned home, Cassie was waiting for him, looking delighted, as though her fake replica was completely oblivious to the tragedy that happened to the real Cassie all those years ago. "You're finally back," she spoke excitedly. "I missed you. How did the assignment briefing go?" "It went fine, thanks my dear," he replied without changing expression on his face in the slightest. "Ready to have a bath together?" she reminded him. He began. "Come on, it will take your mind off everything," she insisted. "All right." Alexander established a connection between his implant and the house computer system so that everything that Cassie interacted with at home in his own vision would be activated directly in real life too. It was a neat feature of the implants, allowing the users to feel that the imagined people they could see were having a concrete effect in the real world. An illusion, but a convincing one at that. When the bath was ready and Alexander got in, Cassie was there with him, speaking sweetly to him with her amiable voice. Having her near was the only thing he wanted. Her voice was soothing, regardless of what she was talking about. He forgot about his assignment within seconds. Everything other than Cassie ceased to matter. Chapter 3. The morning came quickly, and Alexander was ready to get started on the assignment. While he had spare time in the morning, he decided to do a background check on the people he would be questioning. He couldn't dig up much from the information available on the web. They were merely a couple of very ordinary citizens on low income, living in a dreary part of the city. Neither had any criminal records or anything extraordinary at all. They were as average and boring as people come. The time flew by and the search proved to be fruitless, which only frustrated Alexander. Soon he realized that he needed to get going to pick up Jane and start the assignment. He said his goodbyes to Cassie, who blew him an air kiss, and then he left the apartment. It was a cloudy day with occasional gusts of a chilly and unpleasant wind. The traffic on the roads had not yet increased to its full intensity, and life on the streets was still in a state of inertness. He got to Jane's apartment sooner than he had anticipated. Jane wasn't outside yet, so he decided to wait and switch on a small screen on his car's dashboard to pass the time. He flicked through a few channels, having no interest whatsoever in listening to the latest celebrity scandals or political promises from the authority leaders, and he eventually stopped on a channel that was talking about the implants. An expert was being interviewed on a program and was talking about how the implants worked. The implant connects to the decision-making center in our brain, as well as with the occipital and temporal lobes of the brain, to provide visual and audio signals for us to experience, the expert was saying. We've been making leaps of progress in the AI that handles who and what we experience through our implants, tailoring it to our preferences. Moreover, there has now been success on early trials in connecting the implant to the parietal lobe too. This would allow the implant to generate artificial sensations of touch too. This will change a lot about our implants. We'd be able to physically feel sensations with our implant, a cool breeze, a hug, warmth from a fire, you name it. If all continues going smoothly, in a few months this upgrade will become a real thing. We're very optimistic about it. Alexander was quite impressed with the planned improvements to the technology inside the implant, and that the implants would be able to accommodate the touch sensation soon. He'd finally be able to feel Cassie's delicate and loving touch again, and it would make her presence even more real for him. It seemed almost too good to be true. He knew as soon as that upgrade would be for sale, he'd be one of the first in line to buy it, no matter how much it cost. It wasn't possible to bring the real Cassie back from the dead, but with enough advances in the implant tech, Alexander could feel that Cassie could be a part of his life again. "You okay?" Jane was already standing just outside his car window, startling him. "Yes, sorry, was just checking something," he responded and unlocked the passenger side car door for her. Jane got in, looking completely sharp and focused on starting the assignment, clearly having had a good night's sleep. She had her computer pad with her, which was showing a map of the route they needed to take. "I've got the addresses of both people here. Let me transfer them to your car," she said and pressed some on-screen prompts. The data was sent to the car's internal system so that the directions would be automatically shown on the windscreen. "Perfect. Great work, Jane. Let's go and have a chat with the first of those people, Mr. Dabson?" Without further ado, they drove off. The road took them to a part of the city that Alexander wasn't too familiar with. It was a noticeably poorer region of the city. Tighter streets, untidy sidewalks, the buildings had very visible wear and tear, as the colors on them were a mere shadow of what they used to be. Torn plastic bags were scattered in some places, accompanied by a handful of broken bottles and juice cartons. There were a few homeless people in places, down and beaten by life, and even one person lying flat on the ground by a couple of bins, completely passed out from all the booze he had the night before. After what felt like an eternity of driving through dilapidated, claustrophobic streets, they pulled up by a small apartment block that looked just as the same as all the rest in this area. While looking around in all directions, they exited the car and headed for the entrance. Jane notified Alexander that the man they were looking for lived on the 4th floor. On the inside, the building was just as rundown as on the outside. Walls were in a perpetual state of disrepair, discarded drink cans littered the floor, and a sickly smell of decaying food and vermin was suffocating. Jane had to cover her nose the moment they entered. Both feeling uneasy and disgusted, they decided to make haste up the concrete stairs till they reached the 4th floor. Jane pointed at the apartment door where their target lived. Without hesitation, Alexander came right up to the door and knocked firmly. A few moments later, the door swung open. A middle-aged woman stood there without saying anything, looking somewhat aghast at the sight of them. "Hello, we're private investigators, Alexander Calden and Jane Balin. We'd like to talk to Mr. Sean Dabson. Is he in right now?" "Yes, what is this about?" "We'd only like to ask him a few questions. It won't take long." The woman motioned for them to come in. Alexander walked in first, taking a look around the apartment. It was a very modest apartment, tidy to a degree, but not welcoming. All the furniture was old and worn down, and the rooms were small, dull, and perfectly cubical in shape. "How may I help you?" A man in his late 40s entered the living room, a rather suspicious look on his face. Alexander introduced himself and Jane, and then continued. "We've been sent on behalf of Aurora Electronics, as it appears you've been experiencing problems with your implant." "Problems? And how would you even know about that? I didn't contact the customer service." "All of the faults get automatically sent to the database and analyzed," Jane explained. "If something looks particularly serious, it gets investigated, and hence why we're here." "Oh, I see. Well, it was having some issues before, but it's all fine now. It must have probably been resolved on its own. Like you said, everything is sent to your database." "What were the issues with it, Mr. Dabson?" Jane continued. "Just glitches, really. Images and sounds not showing up sometimes, or showing up incorrectly. But it's all working fine now." The man shrugged his shoulders. "Are you sure? The problem could still be there," Alexander pressed on. "Maybe Jane can scan it." "That won't be necessary. I've not had any glitches all day today," Mr. Dabson declined. "But if anything unusual happens again, I'll contact the customer support." "All right, as you wish." Jane decided to leave it be and began heading for the door, not wanting to annoy the man anymore. Alexander held his gaze on Mr. Dabson for a bit more, before following Jane out the door. He could sense that Mr. Dabson wasn't telling them everything. The analysis tools in his implant confirmed it, showing that the man's body language indicated he was not honest. However, there was not much they could do here without further authorization. They lacked any solid evidence and couldn't just arrest him without a good reason. "He's lying for sure," Jane uttered as soon as both of them sat down in the car. "And I don't even need to switch on my implant's analytics to know that." "Yeah, he's a rubbish liar. However, it won't be easy getting information out of him without permission to take this further. Let's see the second guy. If we don't learn anything, we'll notify the bureau and get their recommendation on what to do next." "Alright, where's our second target?" Alexander started up the car. Jane pressed a few things on her computer pad and sent the directions to the car's systems. "The second target is Mr. Dale Tagris. It says he's currently at work. The construction site where he works is not far from here," she stated whilst looking at the information on her computer pad. Without any further words, Alexander drove off. Chapter 4. They arrived at the construction site in just 10 minutes. It was still within the same part of the city, and although the roads and alleys in this neighborhood all looked the same, the navigation tools helped them a great deal. The two investigators exited the car, then approached the man in charge and introduced themselves. They then explained they needed to talk to a certain Dale Tagris, and the man told them to wait for a few minutes as he went to find their target. Only a few minutes had gone past when a rugged man with soot-stained hands came up to them. The man was slightly chubby and disheveled. His curly hair and beard were chaotic and patchy, and he looked older for his age. Clearly, life had not been kind to him. "Hello, I'm Dale Tagris. What is this about?" he asked without a moment's hesitation. Alexander explained why they were there and asked him about his implant. Dale began looking at the ground, trying to avoid eye contact. "I didn't really have any problems with it. You must be mistaken," he finally said. "Are you sure?" Jane asked. "Maybe there was a fault that you didn't notice." "I doubt it. It's all working fine." Alexander could see that this guy was also lying and trying to withhold something. He started losing his patience. "Well, we didn't come here for nothing. At least let Jane scan it." "I don't know who sent you and why, but lay off please and leave me alone," Dale responded with annoyance. A stream of anger all of a sudden coursed through Alexander. Without any restraint, he grabbed Dale by the collar and forced him against a nearby wall, eyes burning with rage. "Look, enough playing games with us. I know you're hiding something, and we won't leave until you speak." "Hey, let me go, you asshole!" Dale shoved Alexander back, trying to free himself. Alexander forced him against the wall even harder. His hands were tightening their grip on Dale's collar. "I know you're lying, just like the last guy, so speak now!" "Alexander, stop that!" Jane intervened. "We won't get anything we need this way." "You want to bet?" Alexander spoke through his teeth without even turning towards her. Before a second could pass since he said that, he rammed his right fist in the guy's face as fast as he could, and then forced his knee in the guy's gut. Before Dale could catch his senses, Alexander threw him onto the ground and drew his stun gun. "I'm going to count till 3. If you don't tell us the truth, I'm going to shock you. And I will keep doing that again and again and again until I get some answers. Is that clear?" Jane was standing horrified, unable to do anything else. She rarely saw Alexander lose his temper like this, although in the last few months, the number of times that he allowed small things to set him off became more frequent than before. He was getting noticeably more irritable and stubborn. All right, what do you want to know?" Dale gave in. His upper lip started to bleed from where Alexander punched him. "Tell us, did someone fiddle with your implant recently? Did anything change in the way it functions?" Alexander asked those questions sternly whilst pointing his stun gun at Dale's face. "Well, there were a few faults and glitches, so I just had someone look at it. It was no big deal." "Was this done with an approved engineer and logged onto the company's system? Or was this illegal tampering?" "It was done by this guy. His name is Derek. I don't know who he is really." "Derek who? What's his last name? How do you know him?" "I don't know his last name." "Lies! You're playing dumb with us." Alexander prepared to electrocute him with the stun gun. "I'm not. Please don't. I honestly don't know his last name. A friend of mine recommended him. Sean Dabson. We go to the same club every Friday. You know, playing cards, watching sport, that sort of stuff." Dale gave away what he knew without any hesitation. "Sean Dabson, we've just been to see him." He was also withholding information. "Where can we find this Derek? Was he also in the club with you?" "No, he wasn't in the club. Sorry, I don't know where he lives. He came to my apartment." "And what did he do with your implant?" "I already told you. He fixed some glitches. Nothing else." "If we find out that you're withholding any more information and are trying to protect a criminal, you'll be charged with a serious offense. We were sent here directly by the government bureau, so you better not play games with us." "It's all I know. Please." Dale turned his face away and closed his eyes, expecting to be electrocuted. Alexander held his gaze for a little longer. It seemed that Dale had indeed revealed everything he knew to them, and there was nothing else they could learn from him. "All right, get out of here and go back to work." He motioned with his gun while still pointing it at Dale. Dale got up as swiftly as he could manage and scurried away from Alexander. He was visibly terrified. "You shouldn't have done that," Jane said after a pause. "We could get in trouble, you know." "Not if we get the job done," Alexander uttered and then turned to go towards the car. Jane followed him with a disappointed look on her face. Chapter 5. Alexander was hastily driving the car back along the narrow streets to the apartment where Sean Dabson lived. He had had enough of lies and was adamant to extract all the information that he needed. His face was fixed in a tight mask of anger and irritation. "Al," Jane began, hoping to speak some sense into him. "Don't try to talk me out of it, Jane." Suddenly, the front of the car sunk downwards and came to an abrupt stop. The two of them were sharply thrown forwards and saved by their seatbelts. A few seconds of shock overtook them and snapped them out of their conversation. Alexander cursed out loud and attempted to reverse the car. However, his attempts proved futile, as the car appeared to have gotten stuck in something. He then tried to move forward again, sharply twisting the steering wheel in all directions, but the car won't budge. "Just great!" he yelled and slammed the steering wheel hard with the palm of his hand. "It's fine, Al. Let's just get out of the car and see what happened," Jane spoke softly after a few seconds. Alexander sighed, and after a short pause opened his car door and stepped out. Jane followed suit. They gathered near the front of the car. Its front left wheel fell into a deep, muddy rut. Alexander crouched down to inspect it, and something seemed off. It looked as though someone had tried to conceal this rut with thin layers of cardboard and dirt. But for what purpose? They both heard faint footsteps behind them. Alexander turned around first, and Jane followed. Two dark figures emerged from a narrow alleyway nearby. "Who's there? What do you need?" Alexander called out. As the two figures stepped closer, Alexander and Jane could see them a little better. Two rough-looking men in their late 20s were approaching and clearly possessed a malicious intent. One was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a shaved head and a hideous scar across both lips. The other was short, skinny, and with a gaunt face, carrying a crowbar. Alexander grabbed onto his stun gun and was prepared to pull it out, but the taller of the two men stopped him with his low-pitched voice. "I wouldn't do that, fella." Alexander narrowed his gaze and saw the taller man holding what looked like a nail gun, aimed in his direction. He froze when he saw it, because he was familiar with how small-time criminals in the poorer parts of the city were modifying nail guns and turning them into dangerous mid-range weapons. He experienced a situation like that on himself merely 2 years ago and remembered it well, for he still had a scar on his right shoulder of where he was shot. "Drop that on the floor," the man commanded, and Alexander reluctantly obeyed. "What do you need?" Alexander asked again with a clear tone of annoyance. "Just all your valuables, money, and gadgets. Once we have what we need, you'll be free to go." He then glanced at the car. "Oh, and you can keep your shitty ancient car. We don't want it." Alexander's annoyance was starting to intensify, and he gritted his teeth. He despised the injustice and the arrogance criminals showed when they simply did whatever they wanted and hurt others in the process. His beloved wife died because of people like that, and since then he swore to always be harsh on crime. With every inch of his being, he wanted to punish every single criminal and make them suffer. In the wake of increasingly boiling emotions at that moment, he was sure he saw Cassie standing there and looking back at him with pain in her eyes. "If you want to take our stuff, then you'll have to come right here and get it all yourself, prick." Alexander taunted the crook, resigning himself to a likely possibility of a painful confrontation. "Are you being lippy with me?" The taller crook walked up to Alexander and pressed the muzzle of the nail gun right up to Alexander's stomach. "I'll pump every single one of these nails into your gut." Alexander was pleased that his tactic of making the criminal come closer had worked. Now he just needed the right moment, a brief window when the enemy would be distracted so that he could... Suddenly, the big tough criminal screamed in pain and closed his eyes as a thin, rapid streak of fluid pierced his eyes from the side. Alexander turned and saw Jane using a pepper spray she had to disable the attacker. Clever girl. Alexander was so impressed with her seizing the chance before him that he forgot what he was even planning to do for a handful of seconds. However, the reality check hit him quickly like a sharp punch, and he grabbed onto the attacker's nail gun and began attempting to wrestle it out of his hands. The criminal's grip was strong, and Alexander couldn't get the weapon off his hands, so instead he merely directed it at the enemy's knees and fired a few nails, precisely hitting the crook in the kneecaps. The pain from that must have been sharp and excruciating, because this loosened the man's grip and he fell onto the ground. Alexander looked up to see where the smaller man was and was slightly relieved, as the smaller man was frozen in place out of fear and was unable to do anything. He simply stared in disbelief whilst tightly holding the crowbar in his shaking hands, clearly being new to and inexperienced at armed robbery. If you don't get your sorry ass out of here right now, you'll be spending the next few days digging these nails out of your hide, Alexander threatened as he aimed the nail gun at the smaller man. The threat worked, and the small skinny criminal momentarily began scuttling away. Of course, Alexander was going to leave him with something to remember this incident for life, in a hope to deter him from trying something like this ever again. So he fired a couple of nails at the criminal, which struck him in the thigh and calf. When a smaller guy abandoned the scene in haste, Alexander turned round and picked his stun gun off the floor before the bigger guy had a chance to get his senses back. The large muscular criminal was peering through his half-open eyes, resisting the stinging of the pepper spray and trying to get back on his feet. Alexander didn't lose time and swiftly struck him on the head with the back end of the nail gun. This successfully knocked the man out, and the two investigators could finally breathe a sigh of relief. "Remind me to never visit these parts of the city again," Jane proclaimed a couple of seconds later, still in a bit of a shock from what just happened. "You've handled the situation well," Alexander responded. "Not our first time getting attacked and needing to defend ourselves. I was just better prepared this time round. Come on, we need to get the car out of the rut." Alexander changed the topic as he didn't want to lose any more time. Alexander asked Jane to get in the driver's seat and pressed the gas pedal whilst he pushed the car from behind with all his might. With some effort, the car was free and they could get back onto their task. "What about him?" Jane pointed at the knocked-out crook right after freeing the driver's seat of the car. "Leave him be. He's not our problem," Alexander replied dismissively while throwing the nail gun into the back seat of his car. Jane didn't argue. Alexander was well aware that she didn't have a bad bone in her body and held mercy and compassion even for lowlifes. But at this instant, he wasn't in a mood to engage in an argument about humanity with her. He wasn't up for taking an injured but violent criminal to a hospital. As far as he saw it, the crook brought it all on himself and had to reap the consequences. Chapter 6. After a short drive, Alexander pulled up his car by the same building they visited earlier, where Mr. Dabson lived. Alexander was committed to finding out everything he possibly could from Mr. Dabson. This time around, he'd be firm and direct, and until he got what he wanted, he wouldn't leave. As soon as they exited the car and shut the doors, Alexander marched towards the building entrance, kicking the trash out of the way and completely ignoring the disgusting smell. Jane nervously ran after him. Once on the 4th floor, Alexander roughly knocked on the door to Mr. Dabson's flat. A few moments later, his wife opened it. Before she could say anything, Alexander pushed the door open. "We need to speak to Mr. Dabson right now," he demanded. The woman took a few steps back, looking scared. Mr. Dabson entered the lobby as he was within the earshot, a deeply concerned look on his face. "I thought I told you there was nothing wrong with my implant," he spoke angrily. "Bullshit. We spoke with your friend Dale Taggart. He admitted to everything, so you better quit lying," Alexander countered. "Admitted to what? How does this concern me?" Alexander grabbed Mr. Dabson by the collar, pushed him against the wall, and then placed the tip of his stun gun against the man's neck. "You still choose to play it dumb? Get out of my house or I'll call the police." "Go ahead. I doubt they'll take your side in this, seeing that we were sent by the government bureau, and you are clearly withholding information and obstructing justice." "Alright, just stop. I'll answer your questions. Just get that thing out of my face. What do you want me to tell you?" "This Derek guy who was messing with your implant, what did he do with it exactly?" Alexander asked whilst releasing his grip and letting go of the man, but still keeping the stun gun pointed at him. He just helped to fix a couple of things that were playing up." "What things?" "Glitches." "Why go to him and not an approved engineer? You do realize it is illegal to tamper with the implants?" Mr. Dabson sighed loudly and shook his head. Alexander could see that he didn't want to say everything, but that there was no other way to explain the situation. Nobody would agree to fix the glitches I was experiencing. The feature that reminds us to pay out debts was really malfunctioning. It kept sending very intrusive reminders into my visual and audio feed almost every minute. "This feature is set up the way it is for a reason," Alexander tried to justify it, even though he could understand Mr. Dabson's plight. "Sending me an intrusive reminder every minute will not help me pay off my debts. The only thing it did was piss me off." "Fine, whatever. I'm not concerned with how you felt about it. Where can we find this Derek guy?" "He lives in Lower Gandridge district." "The address? We need the exact address." "I have it written down. Just let me get it." Alexander backed off a little, but continued pointing the stun gun at him. Mr. Dabson gently headed towards his room and began searching his desk. Alexander followed him in and kept a close eye on him to make sure he wasn't trying to reach for a weapon of any kind. "Here," the older man handed him a piece of paper with the address scribbled. "If this proves to be a fake or a distraction or a trap, then we'll be back here, and our next visit will be very unpleasant for you," Alexander shot threats at him. I understand. It's not a fake or a trap, I promise," Mr. Dabson spoke in a defeated tone of voice whilst looking down at the floor. Alexander didn't lose time. He signaled to Jane with a motion of his hand and headed for the exit. Jane, still aghast and speechless at how Alexander was acting, followed him out. Chapter 7. They were driving towards their destination in silence for 10 minutes straight. Alexander was visibly irritated and was acting with aggression, and Jane was trying to understand why he was losing control of his emotions. "Alexander, please, can we not do anything violent when we see this guy?" she spoke all of a sudden. "That depends on how cooperative he is." "You're better than this, Al. Let's just handle this rationally and by the book. We can't afford to fail this mission. These people have acted in an illegal and dangerous manner. How long till my implant or yours will be subject to someone's tampering? Secondly, if we fail to find and catch the culprit, our rep with the government bureau will fall. This will impact not only the future partnership with them, but also our standing on the market as a whole. Potential clients lack official approval, and there's nothing more official than the endorsement of the government bureau," Alexander explained with cold logic and without taking his eyes off the road. Jane didn't reply. Instead, she turned away to face the window. Alexander could see that she was upset, but he was sure that he was doing the assignment in the right way, and there was no room for softness. In this line of work, sometimes it was necessary to get one's hands dirty and to do things which were harsh and even cruel. Those who weren't prepared for this were doomed to fail. The area of the neighborhood they now found themselves in was in a slightly better condition than the previous few streets. The buildings still lacked character, but the places of residence here looked more respectable and more expensive, and even the street was not so cramped. When they pulled up at the address and exited the car, Jane didn't say anything and silently followed Alexander. They made their way up to the door and rang the doorbell. A few moments later, a woman opened the door. "Yes, can I help you?" she asked, a surprised look on her face. Alexander introduced himself and Jane, as he usually did, and then asked if anyone by the name of Derek lived in the house. The woman looked very nervous at the sound of that name. "It's my son. Why, is he in trouble? What did he do?" "We don't know yet if he's in trouble. We'd just like to ask him a few questions." "He's downstairs in the basement. He often works there by himself." "How old is your son?" Jane decided to ask. "We were expecting an older man." "He's 19, but he often has friends who are much older than him. He's very bright, you know." The mother still looked really concerned and wasn't taking her eyes off Alexander and his stun gun. "Please don't hurt or arrest him. If he's done something illegal, I'll pay for the damages." "We'd first like to hear him out, and then we'll decide on a course of action," Alexander said coldly and walked inside. The mother led both Alexander and Jane past a couple of rooms and then opened the door leading down some stone steps into the basement. Alexander could see light coming from the basement, and once there, he saw the place in a complete mess, full of wires and spare parts strewn all over the floor. A slim, dark-haired young man was busily working on something there behind one of the tables. The guy lifted his head up to see who came in. "Derek, these people want to ask you a few things," his mother stated. "I hope you're not in trouble." "No, it is fine. I'll talk with them." Derek looked and sounded unusually calm. His mother nodded and headed upstairs, leaving Alexander and Jane with Derek. "I knew I'd get tracked down eventually," Derek mentioned as soon as his mother left and closed the basement door. "You were hired by Aurora Electronics, right? Or maybe even by the government?" "That's right. So you confessed to illegally tampering with implants of 2 people?" Alexander questioned sternly and with very little emotion. "Can you please hear me out? I can explain it." "Go on." "These people reached out to me because they really needed help. Mr. Dabson and Mr. Tagris were not the only ones. I've helped at least a couple of dozen of people by now. I was managing to do this without the changes being automatically reported. However, those last 2 guys had the newer version of the implant with better security, so I suspected they likely would have registered an unauthorized entry." "So you knew you'd get caught and you still did it anyway?" "There was a risk, yes, but I wasn't about to turn down someone's plea for help. These implants aren't just tools for our own convenience. They make it easier for authorities and third-party companies to exert a scary level of control upon us. All the people that I helped were being unfairly treated. Their implants kept intruding into their lives, harassing them with carefully tailored adverts and messages of bills and debts. Their personal data was being collected against their desires and then used to lure them into deals they had no choice but to accept. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I had a few people whose implants were receiving instructions to disable some functions, such as entertainment or access to information. These punitive measures are being adopted to punish people for small transgressions, often the things that aren't their fault at all. This is very unjust. Derek continued speaking, surprisingly still in a very calm and clear tone of voice. He evidently had nothing to hide and was proud of what he was doing. Why did they get the implants then if these implants cause so much inconvenience to them? Alexander challenged him with a question. They have to. For some, the implants help with everyday tasks. For others, it's a requirement for their work. These things are a big part of our lives now. We all depend on them. And unfortunately, unlike cellular phones or tablets, we can't just switch the implant off. It's permanently on and is part of our reality. It forms our reality. And soon it's going to get even more intrusive. The next version will be able to simulate touch and pain, and you won't be able to tell the difference between real pain and artificially induced one. Do you think authorities won't abuse this when issuing punishments, or when attempting to make people do what they want them to do? Look, we're not here to discuss what might or might not happen. It's clearly a small minority of people who are having problems with the implants. My job is to arrest you and to take you to the bureau, and that's that. Alexander didn't want to hear any more of it. The boy's speculations and empty accusations were starting to get on his nerves. A small part of him was afraid that Derek's predictions would come true, and he didn't want to believe in that, so he forcefully fought against those thoughts. He wasn't going to let a criminal manipulate him with scary words and prophecies. You say that now, Derek continued explaining himself, but with time more of us will suffer. How long till you will be on the receiving end of these punitive measures? Miss a bill payment, challenge a figure of authority, or hold certain political views, and you could become a target. Whatever the case is, I doubt a solo hacker living in his mother's basement is going to change anything. So I'm bringing you in. You can either go willingly, or I could use my stun gun. It's your choice. Arrest me all you wish. It won't make a difference to me. Derek spoke glumly and stared down. Soon enough, everyone will live like in a prison anyway. I mean, look at what they could potentially do to you. Derek pressed a few commands on a tablet that he was holding, and within seconds Alexander could hear buzzing noises coming from all directions. He gazed all around the room, but there was nothing that was actually making this noise. It all must have just been in his head. Then he heard voices and yelling. Some of those were insulting him or just laughing. A string of flashy adverts then popped up all over his vision, creating a chaotic sea of colors and images. And then, as if by a snap of the fingers, it all ceased, and all Alexander could hear were mere low-pitched humming noises of the devices in the room, and not a single advert pop-up could now be found in his vision. How the hell did you just do that? Alexander asked with undertones of sizzling anger. If I can do that, think what they can do, Derek responded ominously. Go ahead and arrest me, but at least think on what I said and showed you today. Before Alexander could say anything, Jane came closer to him and interrupted. Alexander, he's just a 19-year-old guy. His life is ahead of him. If we pin everything on him, we'll ruin his life. He knew the consequences of his actions, too late to regret that now. We can simply report that he tried to fix the implants of those two men without authorization. That will only result in a fine for him, and no doubt his mother will help him with that. We'll still successfully complete our mission, and nobody will get hurt. But if we go further and pin many more things on him, he could be imprisoned for several years, or at best, end up under house arrest and with no future prospects of ever getting hired. If he's let off easy, he will continue doing what he's doing, and no doubt he will get caught again, and this investigation will be opened once more. We'll get a bad rep for making the wrong judgment call, Alexander argued back. Al, please, we don't need to ruin his life. Our mission only required us to find out why the implants of those two men were glitching, and to reveal if there was unauthorized access. We've now done our job. Jane, I've heard enough. We'll take him in and hand him over to the bureau. They can decide what to do with him once we give them the full report, including everything he confessed to. Yes, everything. I can't let you do it. Jane walked over to stand between Alexander and Derek. If you want to arrest him and ruin his life, you'll have to arrest me too. Jane, stop being foolish. You're letting your emotions cloud your decision making. Oh no, I think it's the other way around, Al. Throughout all day today you've been acting violently, yelling and beating people. What is all this about?" Alexander didn't feel like justifying himself. He took out his stun gun without a second thought and pointed it at Jane. "Jane, one last chance. Move aside." "You really are going to shoot me?" "You're giving me no choice." He then set the stun gun on a low power setting and pressed the trigger. Bright arcs of electricity streamed out and connected with Jane for a brief fraction of a second before disappearing completely. Jane felt a sharp surge of pain coursing all over her body and was unable to control her limbs, which began to convulse on their own. Feeling completely powerless to keep standing, she collapsed onto the floor on all fours. Her breathing was heavy and strained, and she was feeling numb all over, having almost no control of what her body was doing in that moment. "Now you, come quietly or else you're next." Alexander pointed his stun gun at Derek. Derek obeyed without any resistance. Chapter 8. The two investigators left Derek at the government bureau and reported on the details of the situation caused by him. He was no longer their responsibility, and the bureau would handle the rest. It was yet unclear what Derek's punishment would be, but it likely would involve house arrest and prohibition from work in the tech fields. As far as Alexander was concerned, their mission was complete, and a hefty sum of money was on its way to their bank accounts. It was now time to go home. Alexander looked over at Jane. She said no word during the whole car journey to the bureau, and continued being silent even now as they left the building. "Come on, Jane, are you really going to stay mad at me?" Alexander began. "I've just been thinking things over, Al, and I think I'm going to quit working with you. Not only were you acting like a revenge-driven vigilante, but you also showed me a complete lack of respect and didn't care for my position on the matter. Shocking me with your stun gun was the last straw. I don't think I want to work with someone, or hell, even be in communication with someone who is prepared to hurt and belittle me like this." "I'm sorry I did that, Jane. In hindsight, I realized that was too much. It's way too late to regret that. The deed is done, and you still had things your way. Since we have such contrasting ways of doing things, it's for the best that we stopped working together." The realization that Jane was serious about ending their partnership struck Alexander. He felt lost for words and utterly confused. He just couldn't enjoy the success of completing such an important assignment. Life had to ruin it. "We've had a great partnership for 3 whole years. You think one bad day is reason enough to destroy all that?" he then said after a pause. "Today was not an anomaly, Al. Your behavior has been building up to this over the last few months. Today you just took it up a notch, likely because the stakes were much higher. In either case, I'm quitting. I'll send you an official written resignation tomorrow morning. And it's okay, no need to drive me home. I'll take the public transport. Jane, at least sleep on it before making this decision. Goodbye, Al. It was nice working with you, but I'm afraid I cannot in good conscience carry this on anymore." After those words, Jane turned around and began walking away towards the nearest metro station with her head down. Alexander couldn't see her face, but he was sure that she shed a few tears after this exchange. It took him a few seconds to get a reality check and to reflect on what just happened and why it happened. On the one hand, he knew he had to get the mission done the way he saw was appropriate, but on the other, he was disappointed that this mission put him up against Jane and broke not only their business partnership, but their friendship too. Questioning himself every step of the way, Alexander drove back home in total silence. Regret and disappointment kept pounding him repeatedly all the way home. It was evening time already, and he was drained. The mission was mentally exhausting. Once back in the apartment, the image of Cassie appeared in front of him. She wore a beautiful white dress this time that tightly hugged her curves and had her hair neatly tied up at the back. Her eyes that were full of makeup glinted in delight. "My darling, have you had a rough day? You don't look so well." "Yeah, it was a very important mission, remember?" "Of course I remember, but it's all finished now, right?" "It is." Alexander took his coat off and sat down in his favorite chair. He began doubting himself and wondering if it was a good idea to accept this mission in the first place. Was there any other way? Declining a government contract was not only a huge missed opportunity, but it would have also decreased his reputation as an investigator. He wished that Jane could understand, and that they wouldn't have had this disagreement. If only he could have reversed the time and done things a bit differently. "Al, you're hurting, I can see it." Cassie sat down beside him and looked him in the eyes. Her gaze was mesmerizing and impossible to ignore. "Yeah, I've lost a good friend today," Alexander spoke with a mild sigh. "She quit over a disagreement that we've had. And maybe she was right. I threatened and physically assaulted 2 people and ruined the life of a 19-year-old. Maybe I could have handled the situation more rationally, but instead I showed no restraint at all. I am sure you had to do it, Al. You're a good man. You had your reasons. Alexander lowered his head and nodded softly. I did it for you, Cassie. I can't and won't lose you.